Thank you, and it's a hard act to follow coming after all of these wonderful speakers today, and I've definitely enjoyed all of the presentations. I hope you guys have learned as much as I have. I'm sure you have, and I've had a lot of fun working with the JU athletes and then being involved in research with Dr. Hooper. So a lot of people are a little bit confused of exactly what a dietitian does. We wear a lot of different hats on campus. All of the athletes have access to coming in and working with me with their goals, whether it's that they want to more align their training program with their diet, if they want to work on any kind of body composition goals. I have a even mix right now of athletes that want to put on mass, athletes that maybe want to, slim down a little bit, and then maybe some of these athletes have struggled a little bit with, timing their nutrients and that kind of thing. So a lot of different hats in the private practice I work in. We have dietitians that work with people that are trying to lose weight. We have a dietitian that specializes in eating disorders. My specialty is sports, which is why I'm at JU. And then the owner of our company, she's the head dietitian for the Jaguars. And she actually was here before I was. I've only been here for about the past year, or even, the last fall and now spring. So Dr. Taylor already addressed iron quite a bit in his presentation from a medical standpoint. My goal was to kind of come in and talk about it from a performance, and then how we address it on a nutrition, kind of what that protocol looks like, because we're not doctors, so it's similar but a little bit different process. So iron for athletes, it is so important for especially endurance athletes, which we'll address a little bit more than non-endurance athletes, but it is so important in energy metabolism, and the reason is because endurance athletes, they rely a lot on aerobic capacity, and so when there is a deficit of iron, then hemoglobin isn't able to carry oxygen from the lungs to the skeletal muscle. And so Dr. Taylor talked a little bit about iron deficiency without anemia. That's kind of in the beginning stages, okay? So you can, I don't know if you guys can see it, but in the beginning, that's all the way to the left. That's kind of what iron deficient or normal iron levels in the body looks like. So that ferritin that he talked about, the storage iron, that's not affected yet. The athlete feels good, they can breathe good, they don't have any shortness of breath or any of the other symptoms that come into play with the iron deficiency. The next one, you can kind of see the ferritin levels or the storage iron are starting to decrease a little bit, but none of the other lab values, the hemoglobin that we talked about, not affected yet. And then as you go on all the way to the right, you can see that now the hemoglobin is affected, and that mostly is kind of where the athletes start to have symptoms. They're not able to have as much energy. They start to feel shortness of breath. There's a lot of different symptoms they may or may not have, but that's really when the hemoglobin levels are affected. That's when they start to complain, and a lot of times the athletes come and talk to us about it. So it is, again, really important for oxidative metabolism, and that's what the endurance athlete relies on. And then, of course, it has a lot to do with ATP production. So when we do have a shortage, then we rely more on anaerobic glycolysis, and that is not quite as efficient as aerobic glycolysis. Aerobic glycolysis is 18 times more efficient, which I'm sure a lot of you guys already realize that. And so this chart right here is discussing the positive correlation between hemoglobin concentrations and VO2 max. So when the ferritin levels are only affected, it's not quite a linear line as this one. It's mostly when the hemoglobin starts to decrease that it starts tapping into VO2 max, which is everything for the endurance athlete. And then if you do start to supplement when your ferritin levels are low, then it's not necessarily improving your VO2 max. Dietary sources of iron. So two different sources. There's been a big growth of vegetarian and vegan athletes. We've seen a lot of them this year. And so that can be a lot of the athletes here that, they're eating on campus. They don't have any kind of transportation to go and access their own food. this can be a really big challenge for them if they are struggling with the iron deficiency. The animal sources called the heme sources of iron, anything that comes from an animal, meat, fish, poultry, it's more bioavailable, meaning that it's going to be absorbed a little bit better than the plant sources. It absorbs 40% better than the non-heme, which is the vegetarian sources. And we're going to talk a lot more about this. But the plant-based sources, dried, basically any of your starchy vegetables, legumes, fruits and vegetables. And then you have the fortified products. You've been down the grocery store lines and seen on a cereal box how much iron it has in it, or a great source of iron. That's definitely, you got to be careful of that. They want you to buy that box of cereal. It's not necessarily being absorbed in your body quite like the animal sources. So a lot of these athletes that are coming to me during their appointments and have made the choice to be vegan and vegetarians, we're really having to strategize with them what kind of nutrients they're getting, if it's appropriate for a supplement, that kind of thing. So what we have here is on the left, it's the amount of iron consumed along with zinc and copper. And then on the right, it's how much is absorbed. So in the white rectangle is a non-vegetarian diet. So an athlete or an individual that doesn't have any kind of dietary restrictions. In the black box is our vegetarian or vegan athlete. So what you can see is from left to right and is how much is of an iron source is consumed versus how much is absorbed. So all of the black boxes you can, or with the iron levels, you can see that it's just a little line right there. It's like 2 to 4% of that iron from the plant-based source is being consumed. So this is the absorption of heme iron. We absorb all iron in the small intestine, along with a lot of other nutrients is absorbed in the small intestine. And then you can kind of see the absorption of the heme iron is about 15 to 25%. I've definitely, through my experience and my own research, seen different numbers there. But what is kind of constant is that it's much more than the non-heme, which right here, this chart is saying about 2 to 4% of the non-heme iron is absorbed. So this is at risk populations. We talked about, Dr. Taylor kind of addressed this, but female athletes, regular menstrual losses, and then a higher prevalence of calorie restriction. And I find this to be true. I definitely have male athletes that have restrictive diets, but overall, any kind of restrictive diet leads to low energy availability. And then, they have higher, athletes in general just have higher demands. So they have higher demands in terms of macronutrients. So those are anything with calories, protein, carbohydrates, and fat. And then micronutrients is your vitamins and minerals. And so female athletes, just have more restrictive eating patterns for the most part. Vegan and vegetarian athletes, we already talked about, they're restricting the source of iron that's absorbed a little bit better. Endurance athletes, every time as an endurance athlete, your foot hits the ground, you're destructing red blood cells. And that's deteriorating, your body's storage of iron. And then growing athletes, which in the private practice, actually a lot of my athletes here, especially guys, can grow well into their collegiate career. So the younger ones are still growing. And then my high school athletes that I take through the private practice, that's something that we're talking about too, because their bodies are still building red blood cells and growing. So they're at risk for iron deficiency as well. So recommended daily allowance of iron, that's our RDA. We have these for all nutrients. The Institute of Medicine kind of administers these. But if you look at it, some of the research that I've been doing with Dr. Hooper, they have this software called Nutritionist Pro. And what this software is able to do, I don't know if anyone's ever used MyFitnessPal, but this software is basically the MyFitnessPal on another level. It's able to, you can log in what an individual eats, and then they'll give you a breakdown of the micronutrients that they got with a certain food. So what we have been able to see is that there's athletes hitting the RDAs of certain minerals, but it doesn't suffice for a Division I athlete overall. So recommendations at this point for iron would be about 1.3 to 1.7 times for the athlete, for an athlete or these at-risk populations such as adolescents, females, and then 1.8 times higher for vegetarians and meat eaters. because just eating the normal RDA for the general population really isn't going to quite cut it. So iron absorption overall is a complex phenomenon. The reason is there's iron enhancers, there's inhibitors. Actually, there's another marker called total iron binding capacity, and what that tells us is it has an inverse relationship to the ferritin iron. So the lower the ferritin iron is on a lab, the higher the total iron binding capacity is, meaning that your body wants to absorb the iron. And so it's going to have the ability to bind more iron molecules. And then the type of iron consumed, we already talked about how heme is more absorbed than the non-heme. Iron enhancers, that's vitamin C, which is ascorbic acid. You know, there's a lot of research around cast iron skillets that if you cook in a cast iron skillet, then some of that iron from the skillet is being in the food, and now you consumed it and increased your iron intake. And then inhibitors, calcium is a big nutrient, and actually it competes with iron in the absorption site, and more times than not, that calcium is winning. Caffeine is another inhibitor, and then other nutrients in the diet, such as phytates. So diets that are high in fiber, teas, a lot of other healthy things in a diet that we don't necessarily want to tell an individual, hey, don't eat these foods. They're good foods for you. So as dietitians, we're just kind of working on the timing of these foods. So it's very, very hard. It's a double-edged sword because you're trying to enhance iron absorption, which is eating sources of iron with a lot of other nutrients to help it absorb in the small intestine. But then eating too much fiber, and which is common in a vegan or vegetarian diet, can also inhibit absorption. So it is challenging to accomplish good iron absorption. So again, some of the iron enhancers, we already talked about vitamin C, carotenoids. That's basically, you have to think about your foods that are bright in color and have bright pigments. So sweet potatoes, red peppers, stuff like that. And then cooking in the cast iron skillet, research has shown the absorption will increase anywhere from 2 to 12 times higher. Some of the inhibitors, calcium, we already talked about, oxalates. So what you can see is that the oxalate, polyphenols, and phytates, these are all really healthy foods that as dietitians, we don't want to tell people that have an iron deficiency, hey, don't eat these foods. So you can kind of see the challenge there. So just kind of how Dr. Taylor talked about his case, this is kind of how we would address it from a nutrition side. And so this is a case that I had probably a year ago in private practice. So this particular client, he was an 18-year-old high school rower. He had goals of rowing at the collegiate level. I think he was a senior in high school. So the reality of rowing in Jacksonville, it's really hot. Rowing's conducted in an environment, really warm climate. Even when they're rowing outside of Jacksonville, most of the time they're going somewhere that's warm where they might be sweating a lot. He had followed a vegetarian diet since the age of 12. He came into his initial appointment with his mother, who it seemed like a whole household was vegetarians. And then within that year where he met with me, he had adopted a vegan diet. He was 6'2", 185 pounds. For 6'2", for his age and being a male, ideal body weight is 171 pounds to 209 pounds. So the calculation for that is for every 5 feet, this is for guys, we allocate them 106 pounds, and for every inch after that, they get another 6 pounds, and then 10% minus and plus that. So that lands you in the 180 to 185 pound range, or 171 to 209. So he was healthy in that regard, healthy BMI. His only past medical history was that he had seasonal allergies. And then a lot of supplements going on, which is really common for a lot of my elite high school athletes. He did take a plant protein supplement, 25 grams, 2 times a day, creatine 5 milligrams daily, branched chain amino acids 1 gram daily. And then when he came to me, he had not had any labs drawn. So what risk factors did this guy have? So high aerobic demand, one of the speakers earlier, I forget exactly what presentation it was, but they talked about how rowing's one of those sports where they're using multiple energy systems. Therefore, it's an endurance sport and a power sport. So he has the risk factor of being an endurance athlete. There's high sweat losses because of the climate that he is rowing in. And then he's a vegan, so he's not eating the higher absorbed iron foods. And then 18-year-old guy who could potentially still be growing. Collected his diet recall. So his diet had a lot of phytates, meaning fiber in it. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's really common because he is a vegan. And then obviously he's avoiding all animal sources of iron. From the time that I met with him with his first appointment to the next follow-up, all labs were considered normal. So he went and, all the labs came back. Nobody really focused on any of his labs because nothing was flat. However, his ferritin was 17, which we already talked about what is the ideal range for athletes. And then his hemoglobin was 12.2. So again, low end of normal. So his nutrition diagnosis, again, as dietitians, we're not doctors, but we can't diagnose any kind of medical things. But from a nutrition side, he had an inadequate mineral intake, and that was related to basically that he doesn't eat a lot of iron sources that are going to be absorbed well. And then the evidence is that the hard evidence of his labs, and then his dietary intake recall. So intervention, what did I do as dietitian? So kind of anytime that we intervene, we always want to think about what is the biggest problem, and we start from there. And so with that, he got a meal plan that was addressing the fact that he was iron deficient, but it was also matching his demands of rowing. So, most of these athletes are working out more than once a day, so we're tailoring pre and post meals and that kind of thing, and then snacks along the way because he is 6 feet tall and has high energy demands. Implemented sources of vitamin C around all non-heme intake. Encourage cooking his leafy greens in a cast iron skillet. That does two things. Again, we're using a cast iron skillet, and then we're cooking some of that fiber out so that he's absorbing more of that non-heme iron because it's not interfering with the phytates from the fiber. Manage timing of nutrients. We made sure that he wasn't consuming any caffeine or calcium around his iron intake. We educated him. What are the normal ranges of ferritin and hemoglobin going forward? And what does that mean for the athlete? And then discuss the supplement recommendation of the University Athletic Association, encouraged him to talk about it with his doctor. So this is the University Athletic Association recommendations. And so the part in red is really where we started, conversating what would be an appropriate dose of iron for him. So there's different ranges for females and males. So his ferritin being at a 17, the UAA is recommending for him that he's taking 2 to 3 per day. And so what that means is 2 to 3 per day. That's kind of a vague, how many milligrams per dose is that? Is that 25 milligrams? Iron supplements overall, if you go and look in the store, you can pick out 3 different bottles, and one dose might be 25 milligrams, one dose might be 65 milligrams, so they don't really specify that. There's a lot of research that I've read that, you're working with how much should you have versus how much are you going to tolerate. So you always start on the low side. Start with 1 dose of iron per day. And you can split that between morning and night hours so that you give your GI tract a rest, so you're not overloading it all at once, so you don't struggle with constipation or having any kind of stomach aches. So we started with 2 milligrams per kilo of body weight per day, and then over time we increased to 4 to 5 milligrams per kilo per day. And then so that kind of gave us a rough range. But for most athletes that are struggling with any kind of ferritin deficiency, about 60 to 120 milligrams per day is a range that we sometimes work with, which if mathematically you worked out 2 milligrams per kilo or 4 to 5 milligrams per kilo, you would eventually get there. So there's a lot of nutrition kind of guidelines as far as this, where it seems very different. and then you calculate it out, and it's the same thing. So monitoring and evaluating. You never want to give a supplement, kind of like when we were talking about vitamin D earlier. You never want to give a supplement and then just say, do this, good luck, and then never check lab values again. So monitoring and evaluating the adequacy of his oral intake from food. So basically, is he getting the right amount of nutrients at the right time, really? And then the tolerance of iron supplementation. That's great that now we're giving him iron, but if he's not tolerating it, and then that leads to him not wanting to take it because he has a workout, which could be stressful, which also can negatively impact tolerance. That's the biggest thing with any kind of recommendations. There's the gold standard, and then there's what the athlete will actually do and be able to implement safely. And then reevaluate serum ferritin and hemoglobin within 4 to 6 weeks. Intervene as indicated. So in summary, endurance athletes could be at risk for iron deficiency for several reasons. The biggest thing, inadequate oral intake, basically poor bioavailability, meaning that it's not absorbed great, increased losses, because sweat losses, red blood cell destruction, any kind of GI bleeding that can occur with endurance sports. Female athletes are at the greatest risk because of menstruation. And with proper nutritional intervention, iron deficiency can be treated. We always, as dietitians, we're always trying to look at what can we fix through food first with that particular athlete because he was a vegan, and we're never trying to change anybody's beliefs. People choose to be vegan or vegetarians or adopt certain eating lifestyles for a number of reasons. So we like to support that as much as we can and then find other alternatives. So I knew I wasn't going to talk them into, or I wasn't going to attempt to talk them into eating animal sources of iron. So I kind of skipped to supplementation there, but anytime we can fix or improve things with food, we try to. And then supplemental iron, it should be a multidisciplinary approach between dietitians, doctors, to ensure that it is taken in the right amount, and then it's safe as well. So, any questions? Yeah. 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 Yeah, I think that with anything, with any kind of nutritional recommendations, nothing is all or nothing. I believe in like eating foods in a variety of ways, eating a variety of foods. So with that, if someone knew that they had a deficiency, then maybe if they're used to eating all raw vegetables, mixing in, some cooked versions too. That way you're not eating as much fiber because through any heating process, basically the fiber is going to be cooked out. So I would just recommend a mixture of cooking methods. So yeah. Anybody else? Yeah. Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. Sure.
Okay.
If an individual does not know they have this condition, is it reflected in do their labs show? Uh-huh. Mhm. Sure.
All right, good job, Kelsey. Okay, so we thought it would be a nice idea for the second half of this presentation, share with you some of the data that we've been taking from our study this past year, which we called Tracking Track, and that's what Kelsey has been helping us out with. After I initially took the position here, as I mentioned earlier, first person I reached out to was Coach Grigg, and when we got to talking about the sorts of things that we could do, he initially started to talk to me about ferritin. And to be honest with you, I had spent the last couple of years testing or finding out about low testosterone in distance runners, in male distance runners. Didn't know much about the female athlete triad, and really hadn't heard about ferritin specifically at all. I mean, I knew what iron did, and I know how important that was, but I didn't know much about ferritin. So Coach Grigg turned me on to that right away. When I initially wanted to study the female athlete triad, I asked if we could include that with the ferritin testing too, and we ended up coming up with a pretty ambitious study design. As it turns out, this is what we were able to do. Now, we looked at 6 cross-country, Division I cross-country athletes. We actually looked at 10 athletes total, but only 7 of them were cross-country. One of the cross-country athletes had to be excluded from the study, or at least from this data, because the girl couldn't continue training throughout the season. And if you had to guess, why couldn't she continue training throughout the season? No? It's in the iron realm. She basically had extremely low iron or extremely low ferritin, and was showing signs of anemia and was unable to train throughout the season. So kind of appropriate in the circumstances. The time points that we looked at pre and post cross country season during the fall, and then we have also measured them pre-track season, and we'll hopefully measure them post-track season after the conference championships are done. So the first one there is in bold because that's the data that we've been able to crunch at this point, and I can share with you now. We sort of took the kitchen sink approach. We threw everything that we possibly could, everything that we have the ability to assess. We tried to do with the track girls this past year. In terms of the blood, we looked at the ferritin, the T3, and the vitamin D. I don't have all of that data for you today. I'm just going to narrow it down to one area. We looked at RMRs, resting metabolic rate, in terms of their metabolism, which is a really useful tool that I'm excited to share with you. We looked at body composition. We're fortunate to have a bob pod here, and we bob pod pretty much every athlete on campus, so we did that. And then other things that we also did included menstrual questionnaire and overall triad screening. Okay, so in terms of the ferritin, you have a normal reference range. If you Googled ferritin reference range, you would see something like this. It varies from site to site, but it's usually about 10 to 12. Okay, and Dr. Taylor's slide included this earlier. But what can be 10 to 12 can be appropriate for a normal person, but you have to remember what these girls are doing, and it's typical for them to be running, say, 40, 50 upwards miles a week. So that's not enough iron for this quote-unquote abnormal person, if you like. And there's some really nice research out there that shows that 10 to 12 is fine in a normal situation, but that athletes really benefit from being above 20. If they're below 20, it will cost them some element of performance. So it's important to get these athletic women higher than that. So that's the first thing that we have to be aware of right off the bat. So let's take a look at those numbers then. Just a slight formatting issue, but the normal should be right around 10. You can see at the preseason, they were all above normal, right? But normal was still nowhere near good enough. The numbers were nowhere near good enough for the athlete. You can see the average is well below where the athlete should be. Now you can also see there that unfortunately the error bar is quite high, and that's because there's a lot of variability among athletes in this area. But generally you can see that we have ourselves a problem and that they're low. The other thing that you will also notice, right, despite the fact that we were keenly aware of this, that at the postseason it dropped and it got much lower. in terms of statistical significance, obviously I only have an n size of 6, which is not a lot of power. I have quite a lot of variability, so I lose statistical power there. So despite all of that, we actually had a p-value of 0.07. This was almost statistically significant, which is quite an achievement considering the low n size and the massive variability. So clearly just a massive drop going into the postseason. So clearly we have ourselves a problem here. So the question here would then be, why is it so low? And Kelsey referred to this wonderful nutrition program that we have here now called Nutritionist Pro. You can use the MyFitnessPal app nicely to log all of the food records, and then you give it to a graduate student. You tell the graduate student to go enter it into Nutritionist Pro, and voila, all of the data comes right on back to you. So here's the dietary iron. Here's what we found out that these girls were taking in. Here's a nice reference for you. Athletes should aim for greater than the RDA. So the RDA would be 18 milligrams, and athletes should aim for more than that. And here's the 6 athletes that we have. Here are their numbers. You can see that only one of them, well, I guess subject number 2, just a little above RDA. But remember, that was the RDA. At least it was supposed to be much higher than that. So really only one athlete was taking in enough iron, at least to meet the requirements suggested in the literature. So now the question is, well, why are the micronutrients so low? Do they just really not like spinach or something like that? Well, the micronutrients may be low because the macronutrients may be low. And the macronutrients may be low because just overall energy intake is just too low. And that's something that we see in distance runners all the time, men and women. And what we talk about in this area, so I know this whole topic was supposed to be about iron, but you really have to talk about the female athlete triad in this area because the two are so sort of closely married. When we talk about the female athlete triad, you have the nice little triangle, and on the top of the triangle, you talk about nutritional intake. But specifically in the female athlete triad literature, that nutritional intake is referred to as energy availability. And it's a nice term that has a somewhat scary-looking formula at first, but when you break it down, it really makes an awful lot of sense. It's energy intake, so everything I ate, right, minus my exercise energy expenditure. Now, that's a little bit of a problem in our field. That's actually really hard to measure. For our particular study here, we were able to get access to the training logs. We used something really cool called the Compendium of Physical Activities. And if you just Google that, they will give you a MET amount for basically every activity that you can think of, from running speeds to cycling to even like household chores. So I would urge you to check that out. So we estimated energy expenditure, and then you divide it by the fat-free mass, and we get the fat-free mass from the Bob pod. So again, slightly scary-looking equation, but ultimately what it's telling us here is that it's how much energy your muscles have access to over the course of a day, right? So how much you ate, forget all the calories that you also burn in terms of activity, and this is how much energy your muscles have access to. Nativ, in the female athlete triad position stand back in 2007, suggested that menstrual dysfunction can occur at less than 30 kilocalories per kilogram of lean body mass per day. So 30 is the number, and she's referencing a landmark study by Ann Laux, where as soon as, in this wonderful study by Ann Laux, as soon as these women got below 30, well, actually when they got down to 20, the LH pulse went away and they stopped getting their menstrual cycle. So minimum 30, Nativ says, but ideally they should be at 45. So let's take a look at our girls. Energy availability there on the y-axis, and here's the individual subjects on the x. The minimum is here. The target is here. Many below the minimum. This one at least above minimum. Only one of these girls above the target. I say this in my sport nutrition class all the time. The solution to this is simple. It's just not easy, right? It's just eat more. Just please eat more. But that's not actually, it's not an easy thing to do. There's some kind of a reason, and there's many reasons that it could be that these athletes are under eating. So the first thing that you could think of is it could be an eating disorder, which it could be, but it's not always an eating disorder. It could be that somebody at some point has told them to drop weight, and so they're trying to drop weight. It could be that. It may not even be about losing weight at all. It could be this massive amount of activity, and these athletes just don't have the drive to eat. They just don't feel like they need as much food as they really do. But whatever the reason is, the energy availability clearly in these girls, and basically all but one of them, is low. So now this is something that's really amazing about the body. If the energy availability is low, it basically you sort of start starving the body. The body can slow down metabolism to compensate, which is really interesting. So here's a great novel, I mean, somewhat novel marker. You definitely don't see it as much in the literature as you probably should. You can predict what somebody's resting metabolic rate should be, right? RMR, resting metabolic rate, the amount of calories a person burns over the course of 24 hours. You can predict what it should be. Basically because we know how hungry muscle is, we know how hungry fat is, and if we know how much muscle is on your body and how much fat is on your body, we can get a pretty decent estimate as to what your RMR should be. So we can predict it if we have access to body composition, and then we can actually measure it if we have access to indirect calorimetry, or commonly known as the metabolic cart. Okay? So now here's a really cool idea. Take the measured RMR, compare it to the predicted RMR, and if your measured RMR is 90% or less than what it should be based on the good prediction models, then something has happened, right? Clearly your metabolism has slowed down. So that could be a nice marker for us to use as scientists to identify this happening early. And it's non-invasive. There's no consumer cost. You do have to have a metabolic cart. But if you have access to these things, it could be very useful. So let's take a look at the data. First of all, let's just look at the raw RMR. So here's your resting metabolic rate here, as measured by indirect calorimetry. Here's your preseason, your postseason. It might look like it drops, but statistically, it's not even close to dropping. It's pretty close to the same. And if you're familiar with resting metabolic rates and what you would expect from these, remember, these are cross-country runners, female cross-country runners, right? These are small people, right? So 1,500 kcals per day is actually pretty high. It's probably higher than we would have expected. So let's go ahead and compare it because we have the Bob Pod data. Let's go ahead and compare it to the predicted RMR, and let's see what our ratio is. Again, if it was less than 0.9, that would be a problem, sign of reduced metabolism. Not even close. Actually, the metabolism in all of these girls was good. So some good news for once, right? One thing that we also looked at was T3, another somewhat marker of metabolism, sort of a global marker of metabolism. Here's your reference range here. Again, I apologize for the formatting. 80 to 220 off the top of my head is the reference range. Preseason, postseason, well above the reference range. My new friend, Dr. Paholte, has suggested that in future we measure thyroid-stimulating hormone instead of T3 because T3 is very well protected by the body, but thyroid-stimulating hormone not so much, so it would be more sensitive to change. So I will take his advice in future and start looking at TSH. In terms of, to summarize here, the energy availability was not perfect, but some good news, it was actually good enough to keep the metabolism high for once. The iron intake was too low, seemingly, and in conjunction with the reduced ferritin, then perhaps we should consider regular supplementation in many of those girls. Okay, so what can practitioners do, right? Because we're all about turning science into practice. Well, obviously, you can see from what we did this past year, it takes a big team, right? We need phlebotomists, which is myself and a couple of my students who are trained. We need to be able to process the blood, so we need a centrifuge as well as all of the consumable supplies to do that. You need to store it, which is going to need a negative 80 freezer, which is about $10,000 at the cheapest. You need a plate reader, so you need all this expertise and all this money, right? So it's not easy. I assume that you guys don't have regular access to all of this stuff. I would urge your athletes to get an annual physical and request to get a ferritin measurement. It's not a standard measurement within a physical, at least not as far as like a regular health insurance plan would be concerned. So you may have to pay extra. And again, I'm a working class boy. I was a graduate student only 3 years ago. I know when money can be tight, and it could be very difficult to get your athletes to find the money to do this. But I think it would certainly be worthwhile. Something else that you can do outside of to go into the doctor and asking for it is a very cool new idea being really pushed lately by Quest Diagnostics. Has anybody seen this? Comes up in my Facebook feed all the time, but I'm very much in this area, so they know what I'm clicking. But Quest Diagnostics have this really cool thing called Blueprint for Athletes, and you can go into a Quest and you can just pay a certain amount of money for a given package. I asked them over a week ago. I told them I would be doing this. It would be free advertising. Please give me all the information on Blueprint for Athletes, and they never got me anything. So I apologize for not having more information that's just on the website. But that would be an option for you too. The other options that you have are these metabolic markers. You can or possibly have access to predicted RMR. In order to get predicted RMR, all you need to do is be able to get body composition, which yes, would be really nice if it was a DEXA or a Bob pod, but even skin fold calipers can tell you that. And if you have the ability to do skin fold calipers, then you could find out predicted RMR. The harder part is the measured RMR. I'm aware of many of your affiliations of you in attendance. University of Florida have a metabolic cart. I mean, if you're close to here, I would be more than happy for you to come over and use ours. If you could find out from your kinesiology department where you are, if they have a metabolic cart and they have the ability to do resting metabolic rate, you would be able to find this out. So as I say that, and once you actually have the metabolic cart, the nice thing about this test is there is no consumable cost. If somebody has a metabolic cart, it's free to run it. To summarize here, adequate blood iron is unquestionably critical for performance. We really can't deny that. It is essential to prevent low iron. Once you get to the point where you're treating it, as we already talked about, it could take months to get this back up high. Now, I'm not saying give people iron supplementation before you find out what their status is. I'm not saying that, but I would actively encourage you to find out your status, because when you find out that it's low later, it's already too late. And you as strength coaches or sports scientists, people that work with sport coaches, they're going to be unhappy when they find out it's going to take 2 or 3 months to correct this problem. It'd be nicer to just prevent it in the first place. I would encourage either medicals to include it as part of medicals, or Blueprint for Athletes. And then the other concerns just to keep an eye out for in this area too is the triad. All right, that's it as far as my slides are concerned. Any questions on this stuff? Right on time.